The year was 1867, and Missouri was buried beneath a winter that seemed determined to smother every sign of life. Snow covered the fields in heavy silence, while the rivers froze into jagged slabs of ice that cracked like gunshots at night. In farmhouses, candles burned late into the evening, casting shadows against wood-paneled walls. Illness lingered everywhere: scarlet fever, cholera, influenza. But in one quiet village, it was not disease that frightened people most. It was a boy. His name was Timothy Caldwell, and from the moment of his birth, he confounded the people around him. The midwife whispered that his cries sounded different, not the wail of a newborn, but something closer to the long, gasping breath of a man far older. She crossed herself and refused to stay in the house longer than she had to. His mother, pale with exhaustion, told the neighbors that her son never slept. His eyes remained wide open, watching the world with a gaze too steady, too knowing for an infant. By the time he was 6 years old, Timothy had earned a reputation that stretched beyond the village. He was frail in appearance, thin, pale, with veins visible beneath his skin, but strong in ways that unsettled people. He could sit for hours without moving, his expression blank, his chest barely rising as if he no longer needed breath. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that startled even the most skeptical farmers. Doctors came, at first with curiosity, then with disbelief. They tested his reflexes, his heartbeat, his responses to light and sound. Some reported that he had none at all, that his body acted like a shell, unresponsive, lifeless, until suddenly he would sit up and answer their questions with perfect clarity. One physician, unnerved, declared in the town paper that Timothy Caldwell blurs the line between the animate and the inanimate. Another refused to examine him at all, muttering that science was not meant to meddle with such cases. At school, he terrified the other children. When they played games, he stood apart, his eyes fixed on some invisible point no one else could see. One girl claimed she saw him recite a Latin prayer, though no one in the Caldwell family spoke Latin. Another swore he wrote a sentence, backward across his slate, every letter perfectly mirrored. The teacher dismissed it as childish gossip until she saw it herself. The townspeople, practical and devout, tried to explain him away. Perhaps he was touched by illness. Perhaps he was simply strange. But then came the winter of 1867, when Timothy fell ill, or seemed to. His skin grew cold, his breathing stopped, and his mother, weeping, told the doctor her son had finally passed away. A coffin was built. The church bell tolled, and yet 3 days later, when mourners gathered in the Caldwell parlor, Timothy sat up in his coffin, opened his eyes and asked in a clear, calm voice why everyone was crying. The screams that followed could be heard across the village. Some swore the boy had been buried alive. Others whispered that he had never been alive in the first place. The doctor fainted outright, and the Caldwell family, horrified yet relieved, clutched their son as if they feared he might vanish again at any moment. From that day forward, Timothy Caldwell was no longer seen as simply strange. He was something worse, an impossibility. He had died, and yet here he was, alive. He had tricked the doctors, defied the church, and unsettled every person who looked into his unblinking eyes. And as the newspapers began to spread his story beyond Missouri, the world found itself asking a single, terrifying question. If Timothy Caldwell was not dead, then what exactly was he? In the weeks that followed Timothy's resurrection, the Caldwell farmhouse became both a sanctuary and a spectacle. Neighbors came by carrying pies, bread, or candles, not out of kindness, but out of fear, as if offerings might keep the boy's strange condition from spreading. They whispered in the kitchen when Mrs. Caldwell stepped out of the room. They said the boy had tricked the grave, that the devil had touched him, or that he was a punishment sent to test their faith. Timothy himself seemed unchanged by the hysteria. He sat in his chair by the fire, thin legs dangling, hands folded neatly in his lap. His eyes remained fixed, unblinking, on the flames. The only sound he made was the occasional murmur, a single word spoken too softly for anyone to catch. His father swore he was simply weak from his ordeal. His mother insisted he was a miracle. But when night fell, the house revealed a truth far more disturbing. Timothy did not sleep. The first night after his return, Mrs. Caldwell went to check on him in the small attic room where he lay. She expected to find him shivering under blankets, pale and weak. Instead, she found him sitting upright, eyes wide open, staring at the wall as if he could see something moving just beyond it. She tried to coax him down. He said nothing. Hours passed. She dozed in a chair beside his bed, waking to find him still sitting there in the same position, eyes burning in the candlelight. This became a pattern. The boy would lie down when told, close his eyes for a moment, and then, without fail, open them again and remain awake until dawn. When asked why he would not sleep, he answered with a simple statement that chilled his parents. "There are things waiting for me when I close my eyes." Doctors returned to the farmhouse, determined to study him further. One tried chloroform, dripping it gently onto a cloth and pressing it against the boy's mouth. Timothy breathed it in, his chest rising and falling. His pulse slowed. And then, without warning, he sat upright, pushed the cloth away, and said in a calm voice, "You cannot send me there. I'm not meant to rest." The doctor fled the house that very night. Other physicians tried more ordinary tests. They measured his heartbeat and found it sometimes vanished altogether for several minutes, then returned as if nothing had happened. They held mirrors beneath his nose and saw no breath, though the boy spoke clearly moments later. They pricked his finger, and blood flowed too slowly, dark and thick, as though reluctant to leave his body. And yet Timothy insisted he felt no pain. When asked how he passed his nights, he replied, "I listen." The villagers began to hear strange accounts. A farmhand swore he saw Timothy standing outside in the snow at midnight, barefoot, his nightshirt billowing in the wind. A schoolmate claimed she heard him, muttering prayers in languages no one had taught him. The teacher, already wary, caught him scratching words into his desk with a nail. Letters, she later discovered, belonged to ancient Greek. When confronted, Timothy only said, "I have always known." Fear spread faster than the winter illness. Parents forbade their children from playing near the Caldwell's property. Church elders argued whether to exorcise the boy or simply shun the family. Mrs. Caldwell clung to her son with desperate love, while Mr. Caldwell grew gaunt, muttering that they should have left him in the ground. One night, when a heavy snowstorm trapped them indoors, the family gathered around the fire. The wind howled through the cracks of the cabin walls, and the candlelight flickered low. Timothy sat silently as always until the fire began to die. Then he turned to his parents with eyes that did not blink and whispered, "I saw what waits for you. It is already here." The room fell silent. His father demanded he explain. His mother wept. But Timothy said nothing more. He simply turned back to the fire, the glow painting hollow shadows across his face, and watched as the last flames sputtered into darkness. That night, neither parent slept. For if the boy would not close his eyes, then perhaps they should not either. By the early spring of 1867, Timothy Caldwell was no longer just a local curiosity. His name had begun to spread beyond Missouri, whispered in taverns, reported in cautious lines of local newspapers, and debated in hushed tones among physicians who prided themselves on rational thought. How could a child be pronounced dead by reputable doctors, remain without pulse or breath for days, and then rise again with calm, unnerving clarity? The Caldwell farmhouse soon became the stage for something. Closer to a public trial than a medical visit, physicians arrived from St. Louis, their boots muddy from the thawing roads, their satchels heavy with instruments of measurement and proof. They came not only to examine the boy, but to disprove him. For every doctor who failed to explain, Timothy's condition was another who risked ridicule in the journals of medicine. Dr. Horace Winfield was among the first of these skeptics, a stern man with a reputation for exposing charlatans. He arrived one evening carrying a stethoscope and a grim certainty that the Caldwell family was orchestrating a fraud. He examined Timothy in front of a small gathering, placing his ear to the boy's chest. frowning when he heard no heartbeat, then straightening with a sharp laugh.
"Either this child is not alive," he declared, "or my stethoscope has failed me."
Timothy, sitting calmly in his chair, tilted his head toward the doctor. His lips curled into what might have been a smile, though it never reached his eyes. "Your ears deceive you," he said softly. "But I do not." The crowd shifted uneasily. Winfield flushed, muttered that he would return with more reliable instruments, and left without taking supper. He did not return. Other doctors were more determined. They brought mercury thermometers, scalpels, lancets, and notebooks. They measured Timothy's body temperature, only to find it strangely cold, closer to that of the winter air than living flesh. They tested his reflexes, none. They pricked his skin, and the boy did not flinch. Yet when they spoke to him, he answered in perfect sentences,
often anticipating their questions before they asked. One physician wrote that the boy possessed
a condition beyond the limits of known physiology,
existing in the interval between life and death.
Another crossed himself and refused to write anything at all. The newspapers loved it.
Headlines described
"The Missouri Boy Who Will Not Die," and "A Living Corpse in Caldwell's Farmhouse." Some painted Timothy as a hoax. Others whispered of dark miracles. The Caldwell family, once obscure farmers, now found strangers peering through their windows at night, eager for a glimpse of the impossible child. The church could not stay silent either. Reverend Samuel Briggs, a fiery preacher with a talent for rousing fear, thundered from his pulpit that Timothy was an abomination, a child cursed by God to test the faithful. He demanded the family present the boy for a cleansing ritual. Mrs. Caldwell refused, clutching her son to her chest as if the congregation
itself threatened to rip him from her arms.
The standoff between faith and science deepened, and at the center sat Timothy, pale, watchful, and disturbingly composed. He spoke little, but when he did, his words burrowed into the minds of those who heard them. To one physician who pressed him with endless questions, Timothy simply said, "If you measure me long enough, you will find yourself measured instead." To the reverend who demanded he confess his sins, Timothy replied, "What sins can a body commit when it is no longer its own?" And to his father, who once begged him to act like a normal boy, Timothy whispered in the stillness of night, "Would you rather I lay still again, Father?"
"I can do that. I can lie still forever."
The boy's voice carried no malice, no humor, only a quiet sincerity that frightened even more than anger. As spring turned to summer, the Caldwell household had become a kind of purgatory, trapped between the watchful eyes of science and the condemning voices of the church. Timothy remained at the center, a child neither fully alive nor convincingly dead, a boy who seemed less like a patient and more like a mirror, reflecting back the fears, doubts and hidden terrors of everyone who came to see him. And yet, as the visits mounted, so did the unease. Because one thing became painfully clear: Timothy Caldwell was not weakening. He was not fading as a sickly child should. Instead, with each passing week, his gaze seemed sharper, his presence heavier, as though something inside him was quietly gathering strength. And soon, the village would discover that the doctors had been asking the wrong question all along. The problem was not how Timothy lived. It was what he might do with the life he should not have. By midsummer of 1867, the Caldwell family's fear had shifted from Timothy's body to his mind. If the boy's stillness and silence had unsettled the doctors, what he began to say unsettled everyone else far more. It started with small things. At the supper table, while his parents and sisters ate in tense silence, Timothy would suddenly murmur a line of scripture neither of his parents recalled teaching him. When asked where he had heard it, he would shrug and say, "I didn't hear it."
I remembered.
The words grew stranger. One evening, he whispered an entire psalm backward, every syllable precise, as if he were reciting a language only he and the shadows understood. His mother wept and begged him to stop. His father struck the table with his fist, but Timothy only stared, as if daring the wood itself to splinter beneath his gaze. Then came the night he described the contents of Reverend Briggs's locked study. The preacher had come once more to press the family. demanding Timothy submit to the church. The boy remained silent until the reverend turned to leave. Then Timothy spoke in a low, steady voice. "The drawer to your left. The letters from the woman in St. Louis, the ones you hide under your Bible." The reverend froze, color draining from his face. He spun on the child, sputtering denials. But Mrs. Caldwell noticed the tremor in the preacher's hands, the way he could not meet Timothy's unblinking eyes. He stormed out, slamming the door, never to return. From then on, Timothy's words spread like a fever. Farmers whispered that he predicted the collapse of a barn roof a week before it fell. A widow swore he told her the date her cow would die, and he was right to the very day. Even the skeptical schoolteacher, who had dismissed so many rumors, confessed in secret that the boy had written her deceased father's name spelled perfectly on a slate. She had never spoken that name aloud in Missouri. The doctors who remained became fascinated, desperate to record these incidents. They asked the boy questions in Latin, in French, even in Greek. To their horror, he answered in all three, sometimes haltingly, sometimes fluently, always correctly. One physician, his voice trembling, asked how a farm child from Missouri had acquired such knowledge. Timothy's response was simple.
"I knew it before you asked."
The questions are late. The answers are already here. The more he spoke, the more the Caldwell family withered under the strain. His sisters refused to share a room with him, claiming he muttered in his sleep, or worse, that he didn't sleep at all but lay staring at the rafters, whispering to someone unseen. His father began spending nights at the far edge of the property, too afraid to hear what his son might reveal about him. His mother alone remained at his side, torn between maternal devotion and creeping dread. But the village had made up its mind. To them, Timothy Caldwell was not simply peculiar.
He was dangerous.
Because if he could see their secrets, what would stop him from revealing them? If he could predict the future, was he guiding it or causing it? The gossip turned sharp, then poisonous. Children were warned not to speak his name.
Men muttered about curses, about the devil's mark, about fire as the only cure.
Women crossed themselves when they passed the Caldwell gate.
And yet, some came to him in secret.
A grieving mother begged him to tell her if her infant had reached heaven. A farmer asked if the rains would ruin his crops. A soldier's widow whispered, trembling, if he could tell her whether her husband had truly died in the war, or if he still wandered lost in the South. Timothy answered them all, sometimes with comfort, sometimes with silence, and sometimes with words that echoed too perfectly in their lives to be coincidence. The strangest of all came late one night, when Mrs. Caldwell found her son sitting upright in the parlor. He was staring out the window at the road, though no one was there. She asked what he was looking at. Without turning, Timothy said, "The men are coming."
"Not for me." "For you."
When she pressed him to explain, he said nothing more. 2 weeks later, 3 men arrived at the Caldwell home, carrying legal papers that would seize part of their land over unpaid debts. Mrs. Caldwell nearly fainted when she saw them on the road. Timothy only looked at her with calm, knowing eyes, as though the moment was not unfolding but repeating. By then, his mother no longer dared to ask how he knew what he knew, because she feared the answer would be worse than ignorance. By the late summer of 1867, the physicians who still lingered in Missouri had grown restless. For months, they had observed Timothy Caldwell, measured him, questioned him, written endless notes, and yet they remained no closer to understanding what he was. The boy's pulse never returned, his skin remained cold, and yet he continued to speak, to think, to learn. Observation was no longer enough. They wanted proof. They wanted control. Dr. Julius Merrick, a young physician from St. Louis with ambitions for fame, proposed what he called a series of necessary examinations. Where others had faltered, Merrick promised he would succeed, and his name would be etched into the journals of science. The Caldwell family, weary and frightened, resisted at first, but Merrick assured them the tests would not harm the boy, that they were meant only to reveal what nature had hidden.
Against their better judgment,
And under pressure from the community, they relented. The experiments began in the parlor of the farmhouse. with villagers pressed to the windows outside,
eager for a glimpse of the spectacle.
Merrick laid out his instruments on the table: scalpels, needles, glass jars, thermometers, and a curious contraption of tubes and wires he had brought from the city. The first test was simple. He pricked Timothy's hand with a needle deep enough to draw blood. But no blood came. The flesh dimpled, then closed, as if resisting the intrusion. Merrick frowned and tried again, this time harder. The same result. The boy sat still, unblinking, as though he felt nothing. Merrick's frustration deepened. He pressed his stethoscope to the child's chest. Still nothing. Then he forced Timothy to inhale fumes of burning. Herbs meant to test his respiratory reflex. The boy breathed them in, coughed once, then said softly, "You're not listening, Doctor. It isn't breath that keeps me here." The villagers outside gasped when the words were repeated to them. More tests followed. Merrick attempted to draw heat from Timothy's body by placing warm compresses against his skin, only to find the cloths cooling unnaturally fast. He weighed the boy, recorded the numbers, then weighed him again hours later, only to find the weight had changed without explanation. One evening, Merrick pricked Timothy's fingertip once more. Determined to draw blood, this time a single drop welled up, dark, thick, and far colder than it should have been. Merrick recoiled, muttering, "It is not right.
It is not right."
But still he pressed on. The most disturbing moment came when Merrick tested Timothy's reaction to pain. In front of the horrified Caldwell family, he pressed a heated iron close to the boy's arm. Mrs. Caldwell cried out, begging him to stop. Timothy, however, did not flinch. His eyes fixed on Merrick's face, steady and unnerving. Then, in a voice quiet enough that only the doctor heard, he whispered, "You burn yourself, Doctor, not me." Merrick jerked back, startled. Later that night, he was seen clutching his hand in agony. Though no one else had witnessed him touch the iron, rumors spread quickly that the boy had turned the pain back on him, that he was more than a passive subject. The villagers, once entertained by the spectacle, began to murmur of curses again. Some claimed Timothy's gaze alone could sour milk, or that his voice had driven a farmhand to madness. Whether these were truths or fears hardly mattered. The legend of Timothy Caldwell grew darker with each telling, but the experiments were not without cost. Though Timothy never showed weakness, those who lingered near him did. Dr. Merrick himself grew pale and restless, plagued by dreams he refused to describe. Other physicians began to withdraw, claiming sudden illness or urgent matters back in the city. Within weeks, Merrick stood alone, the last of the brave men of science, willing to prod the impossible boy. And yet even he could not continue forever. For the night came when he collapsed in the Caldwell parlor,
his hands trembling, his eyes wide with terror.
He insisted that Timothy had spoken to him in a voice that was not the boy's own, a voice that echoed inside his skull, commanding him to stop. Merrick left the next morning, leaving his instruments behind.
He never returned to Missouri.
The villagers whispered that Timothy had finally broken the doctor. That, perhaps, the boy had been allowing these experiments all along, waiting for the moment when the men who thought they were in control realized they had never been the ones conducting the tests. For the first time, even Mr. Caldwell, the boy's father, who had clung to denial, looked at his son and saw not a child, but something vast, cold and calculating, something that tolerated interference, but only on its own terms.
And Timothy
simply sat in his chair, silent and watchful, as though every attempt to measure him had been nothing more than a distraction. Because whatever he truly was, he was not a subject.
He was the experimenter.
By autumn of 1867, the Caldwell farmhouse stood like a scar on the edge of the Missouri countryside. To passers-by it looked ordinary, weathered timbers, a sagging porch, smoke curling from the chimney. But to the villagers it was no longer a home. It was a place where science had failed, where the church had fled, and where something not quite human sat waiting. Children were warned not to linger near the fence line. Farmers crossed themselves as they rode past. women whispered as they hung laundry, lowering their voices when the name Timothy Caldwell passed their lips. Even the air around the farmhouse felt different, heavier somehow, as if the boy's presence reached beyond the walls and into the land itself. Rumors multiplied like weeds. Some said Timothy had caused the summer drought, that his silence had drawn the clouds away. Others swore he could sour milk just by looking at a cow, or that he had been seen walking in the fields.
At night, though, he was never allowed out of the house.
More terrifying still, a group of hunters claimed they saw him standing at the edge of the woods one evening, pale as moonlight, though at the same time his sisters insisted he had been inside the parlor,
staring at the fire.
Fear turned the villagers against the Caldwells. Neighbors who once shared meals with the family now avoided them. Trade dried up. Men who owed favors to Mr. Caldwell suddenly refused to honor them. Invitations ceased. Even Reverend Briggs, who had once thundered from the pulpit about casting out evil, would not look toward the farmhouse when he passed it on horseback. But fear never lingers in whispers alone. It grows teeth. One evening, a mob of townsfolk gathered in the tavern, their voices thick with drink and unease. They spoke of the boy, of how long they would tolerate his unnaturalness,
of what must be done to protect their families.
Some muttered about exorcism, others about fire. A farmer's wife, pale and trembling, declared that her dreams had been filled with Timothy's eyes, staring at her from the darkness. When she woke, her infant had been burning with fever. To her, there was no coincidence. The Caldwell family, though isolated, could not ignore the rising tension. Mr. Caldwell fortified the farmhouse, keeping his rifle within reach. His daughters clung to one another, refusing to leave the house after dusk. Mrs. Caldwell prayed ceaselessly, her rosary beads worn smooth from desperate fingers. Yet even she, in her quiet heart, began to wonder, was her son truly hers anymore? Timothy seemed untouched by it all. He neither feared nor defended himself. He sat in his chair, eyes drifting from the window to the fire, as though the world outside was of no concern. If he heard the whispers, if he felt the growing hatred, he gave no sign. And that silence, more than anything, fanned the flames of fear.
'Cause silence can be mistaken for plotting.
When the harvest failed early that year, men spat and said the boy had cursed the fields. When a storm tore through a nearby farm, flattening a barn, villagers whispered that Timothy had looked too long at the sky. By November, the tavern talk had turned to action. "They won't do it themselves," a farmer muttered over his mug of ale. "But they'll wait until we have no choice. The boy has to be stopped before he stops us all." Not all agreed. A handful pitied the family, arguing that Timothy was no more than a sick child. But pity is thin protection when fear grows thick, and the fear was spreading fast. The breaking point came when the widow Emmeline Harper, already brittle from grief, swore she had seen Timothy standing at the foot of her bed in the dead of night. He said nothing, only stared. She screamed until the neighbors came running, but when they searched, no trace of the boy could be found. Still, her testimony was enough.
"He was there," she insisted, "and he wasn't alone."
That was the night the whispers hardened into a plan. Men spoke of torches, of holy water,
of iron nails driven through doors and windows.
They did not yet march, but the resolve was there, coiling tighter with every passing day. Inside the farmhouse, Mrs. Caldwell sensed it. She looked at her son, her pale, silent,
unblinking son, and
shivered with the knowledge that the village would not wait much longer. And perhaps, she thought in the stillness of her prayers, perhaps they were right. By the winter of 1867, the Caldwell farmhouse no longer felt like a refuge. Its walls creaked under the strain of silence, and every candle burned longer than it should, as if time itself bent strangely inside those rooms. Outside, the villagers sharpened their fear into purpose. Yet it was the nights inside the house that carved the family down to bone and nerve. They began to keep watch. Mr. Caldwell, stubborn and red-eyed from lack of sleep, sat with his rifle across his knees, his gaze fixed on the front door. The daughters huddled together in the upstairs bedroom, whispering prayers until their voices broke into sobs. Mrs. Caldwell, kept vigil in the parlor with her rosary beads.
always within reach of her son.
The house became a garrison, yet against what they could not name. Timothy, for his part, never asked for protection. He did not move from his chair unless guided, did not resist their constant watching. But something in his demeanor shifted. He was no longer the fragile boy to be guarded. He seemed aware. His eyes followed each member of the family with unsettling patience, as if their movements were lessons in a language only he understood. At first, they told themselves it was imagination. That exhaustion made shadows longer. That sleeplessness made the boy's gaze feel heavier than it was. But then came the nights when they would swear they saw him, standing in doorways where no one had placed him. On one particularly brutal night in December, a storm rattled the shutters until the farmhouse moaned. Like a living thing, Mr. Caldwell dozed by the fire, his rifle slipping in his lap. Mrs. Caldwell stirred from her prayers to check on Timothy, only to find the chair empty. Her heart lurched. She called his name, her voice trembling, waking her husband. Together they searched the room, the hall, the kitchen, until at last they found him standing in the upstairs hall, directly outside his sister's room. He said nothing, only turned his head slowly to look at his parents, his face calm, his eyes impossibly wide in the flickering lamplight. His sisters whimpered from behind the closed door. Mrs. Caldwell nearly fainted with relief when her husband guided the boy back to his chair. But she never forgot the stillness of that figure at the door, the way he seemed less like a lost child and more like a sentinel keeping his own kind of vigil. The watches grew harsher. Strange sounds haunted the night, scratching within the walls, as though mice had multiplied into armies, or something larger pressed against the timber from the inside. The family dog, once faithful, now refused to enter the parlor. It sat at the threshold and whined whenever Timothy's eyes met its own. Eventually, the dog vanished altogether, and though Mr. Caldwell searched the fields, no trace was found. Sleep became impossible. When Mrs. Caldwell closed her eyes, she dreamed of Timothy's face, only it was not her son's face at all, but something colder, older, unyielding. The daughters began waking with bruises on their arms, though they swore they had not left their bed. And Mr. Caldwell, the man who had once dismissed all talk of curses, began muttering prayers beneath his breath when he thought no one heard. The village, too, kept its own night watches. Men took turns walking past the farmhouse with lanterns, pretending to patrol for wild animals, though everyone knew their eyes were fixed on the windows. From the darkened parlor, Timothy would watch them pass, and though he never waved, never spoke, the men quickened their steps when they saw his pale outline in the glass. The tension wound tighter with each hour of darkness. Something was coming. The family knew it, the village knew it. Yet no one dared make the first move. Until one night in January, when Mrs. Caldwell swore she awoke to Timothy, whispering in a voice that was not his own. She crept down the stairs to find him seated in his chair as always, but his lips moved soundlessly. The fire had burned low and the shadows seemed to bend toward him, as if listening. When she stepped closer, she heard a fragment, no louder than breath. "They are waiting. They are coming. But it is I who will decide." Her rosary beads slipped from her hand, scattering across the floor. She did not pick them up, for in that moment she knew the truth. The night watches were never for Timothy's safety. They were for theirs. By late January of 1868, the Caldwell farmhouse had become a wound in the heart of the village, something festering, something everyone felt, but no one dared to lance. The night stretched longer, colder, heavier with the knowledge that nothing could remain as it was. Fear was no longer enough. Fear demanded action. It began with the children. They whispered of shadows at their windows, of hearing their names breathed into their dreams. One boy refused to leave his bed for 3 days, pale and trembling, swearing he had seen Timothy standing by the well at dawn, though his parents insisted the boy hadn't left the farmhouse. Another child awoke screaming with scratches across his chest. The physician could find no cause, and his explanation, that the boy had done it in his sleep, satisfied no one. The tavern became a cauldron. By day the men labored in silence, but by night their voices boiled over mugs of ale, circling the same conclusion. They spoke of curses, of blight,
Of the wrath of God. They spoke of Timothy not as a boy, but as a thing, a parasite, a phantom, a devil lodged in flesh.
They spoke of fire. The women tried to soothe them, but they too were fraying. Mrs. Harper, already convinced Timothy had invaded her dreams, grew hysterical and claimed her infant had nearly suffocated in the night. She swore she had seen a pale hand pressing on the child's chest,
Vanishing when she struck the lamp.
Others told similar tales, nightmares, illnesses, strange lights in the fields. Whether these things happened or were born of fevered imagination no longer mattered. Fear had gained flesh. Inside the farmhouse, the Caldwell family felt the noose tightening. Mr. Caldwell kept his rifle loaded, though even he admitted it would not help against an entire village. His daughters refused to leave their room, whispering prayers until their throats were raw. Mrs. Caldwell hovered between faith and despair, clutching her rosary though she knew the beads offered no shield.
And Timothy.
Timothy changed. The boy who had once sat mutely in his chair now seemed to wait. His eyes followed the door more than the fire, as though he knew what gathered beyond those walls. Some nights he rose and paced slowly, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor. He moved with the patience of someone who knew there would be a reckoning and that it would come soon. On the evening of January 29th, the breaking point arrived. A bell tolled in the village square, not the church bell, but a cracked iron one brought out only for fire or calamity.
Its sound split the night like a blade.
One by one, lanterns flickered to life. Men with axes and torches, women clutching their children, gathered in the snow. The air was thick with frost and fury. They would march to the Caldwell farmhouse. They would end this. Inside, Mrs. Caldwell heard the bell and dropped her rosary. Mr. Caldwell cursed under his breath and barred the doors. The daughters clutched one another, crying, "They're coming, they're coming." Timothy sat upright in his chair, utterly still, listening. And then, for the first time since this nightmare began, he smiled. It was not a child's smile. It was something colder, sharper, as if it had been practiced for centuries rather than years. His lips curved slowly, deliberately, until Mrs. Caldwell gasped and stumbled backward, crossing herself again and again.
"Henry," she whispered to her husband, her voice breaking. "He knows."
He's been waiting for this. Outside, the mob began to chant. The snow muffled their steps, but their voices carried, "Burn the curse.
Burn the house."
Burn the boy." The Caldwells stood frozen, the walls trembling with every cry, and Timothy, still smiling, turned, his head toward the door, as though welcoming guests long overdue. The breaking point had come, and with it, the line between superstition and truth would shatter forever. The Caldwell farmhouse shook as fists pounded against its door, the wood groaning beneath each strike. Snow swirled outside, torchlight casting long, twisted shadows across the windows. The chanting grew louder. "Burn the curse. Burn the boy."
End this tonight.
Mr. Caldwell held his rifle steady, though his hands trembled so violently he feared he might fire without meaning to. His daughters sobbed upstairs, clutching each other as the mob's fury rattled the very floorboards. Mrs. Caldwell, pale as death, clung to her son's chair as if anchoring herself to reality, and Timothy sat calmly, hands folded in his lap, watching the door with an almost ceremonial patience. That smile still clung to his lips. It was the expression of someone who had not been caught, but rather had been waiting, inviting. The door burst open. Splinters flew across the room as men stormed inside, lanterns in one hand, axes in the other. Their boots slammed against the floorboards, leaving streaks of slush and ash in their wake.
At first, they demanded Timothy be handed over.
"Give us the boy," one shouted, his face red with fear, disguised as anger. "We'll end this sickness."
It dies with him.
But Mrs. Caldwell threw herself in front of her son, spreading her arms wide. "You will not touch him," she cried, her voice shrill with desperation. The men hesitated. For all their fury, It was difficult to strike down a mother shielding her child. Yet the chanting outside pressed them forward.
One stepped closer, raising his axe.
And then Timothy spoke. The farmhouse fell silent, as if the very storm outside had paused to listen. His voice was calm, measured, not the voice of a 12-year-old boy, but something older, deeper.
"You cannot harm me," he said.
"You cannot end what does not belong to you." The man with the axe froze. His hands shook as his eyes locked on to Timothy's. A moment later, the weapon slipped from his grip and clattered to the floor. His knees buckled. He collapsed, gasping, clutching his chest. The mob roared in confusion. Some shouted prayers, others curses. Two men dragged their fallen companion back into the snow, but his screams echoed long after he was gone. Mr. Caldwell tried to steady himself.
What are you, boy?"
His words trembled as if he already feared the answer. Timothy turned his gaze on his father, not with malice, not with love, but with a strange,
unsettling neutrality.
"I am what I was made to be," he answered, "and I will remain whether you believe or not." The villagers surged again, desperation eclipsing fear. They hurled their torches into the room. Flames licked the wooden walls, smoke curling upward. The daughters screamed from upstairs. Mrs. Caldwell clutched Timothy tighter, her tears falling onto his still, pale hands. But Timothy did not move. He rose slowly, deliberately, as if time bent around his actions. His eyes caught the firelight, and for a fleeting moment, his face looked unfamiliar, too sharp, too knowing, as though someone else peered through his features. "Do you not see?" he asked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "The fire is not for me. It is for you." And then impossibly the flames bent. Those nearest the hearth cried out as the fire swelled unnaturally, roaring not outward but inward, curling back toward the mob like a living beast. The torches sputtered in the villagers' hands, their flames extinguished in an instant. The room filled with smoke, and yet Timothy stood untouched. The air around him strangely clear. The mob faltered. Fear, once their weapon, now turned against them.
Men stumbled over one another in their rush to flee.
Women shrieked from the yard. The chants dissolved into chaos, into prayers, into screams. Within minutes, the farmhouse was empty save for the family and the boy, who no longer seemed to belong to them. The mob scattered into the storm, their cries carried away on the wind. Silence returned, broken only by the crackling of embers in the hearth. The fire, as if obeying, died down to a gentle glow. Timothy looked at his parents, at his trembling sisters descending the stairs,
at the ruin left in fear's wake.
He smiled again, softly this time, almost kindly. "They will not return," he said, "not until it is too late." And in that moment, the Caldwells understood the terrible truth. The village had not rid itself of a curse. It had only awakened it. By dawn, the Caldwell farmhouse stood silent against the snow, its windows blackened, its doors splintered from the mob's assault. The village lay in uneasy quiet, no one daring to speak of what had happened the night before. The mob had fled in terror, but terror was not so easily escaped. It lingered like smoke, seeping into every home, every prayer, every breath. The Caldwell family, what remained of them, moved through the house like ghosts. Mr. Caldwell sat hunched at the table, rifle across his lap, staring at nothing. Mrs. Caldwell knelt in the corner, whispering fragments of scripture, her rosary beads slipping through trembling fingers. The daughters avoided their brother, avoiding even his shadow, whispering only when they believed he could not hear.
And Timothy?
He was unchanged. He still sat calmly in his chair or wandered slowly from room to room, his eyes too steady, too ancient for the face of a boy. He ate little, spoke less, and when he did, his words cut through the silence like a blade, calm, deliberate, undeniable. He never mentioned the mob, never explained the fire that had turned against them. He didn't need to. For weeks the village lived in quiet dread. No one returned to the farmhouse.
No doctor dared knock on the door.
The church held vigils every night, the priest's voice breaking as he begged God to lift. the darkness that had fallen over them. But heaven remained silent, and the snow kept falling. Stories began to spread. Some claimed Timothy had been seen walking alone at midnight, barefoot in the snow, leaving no footprints. Others swore they had seen him standing at their windows, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. A farmer's cattle sickened and died. He blamed Timothy. A woman miscarried. She said she had dreamed of Timothy the night before.
Rumors multiplied like frost across the glass.
By spring, the Caldwell family was undone. Mr. Caldwell was found in the barn one morning, rifle discharged into his own chest. The daughters were sent to distant relatives, their minds broken by fear and sleepless nights. Mrs. Caldwell lingered longest, clinging to her son even as her health failed. "He's still my child," she whispered to the priest, though her eyes were hollow. She died in June.
That left Timothy.
No one knows exactly what became of him. Some claimed he wandered into the woods and never returned. Others believed he lived for decades, never aging, appearing now and again in neighboring towns before vanishing once more. The bravest said they saw him boarding a train headed east, dressed in a black coat, his pale hands clutching a book no one could read. The newspapers that once printed his story fell silent. Medical journals that had spoken his name retracted their accounts, calling them exaggerations or outright lies. The church declared the Caldwell case an incident of hysteria. And yet the villagers never forgot. They told their children to stay indoors after dark. They salted their thresholds in winter. They crossed themselves when a child was born with eyes too steady. And through it all, the question remained. What was Timothy Caldwell? A boy? A curse?
A spirit wearing human flesh?
Or something older still? Something science and scripture alike had no words for. What we know is this. In the winter of 1867, a boy lived, died, and lived again. He fooled doctors. He defied the grave. He bent fire to his will and sent a village fleeing into the night. And then, as quietly as he came, he disappeared, leaving behind only stories, whispers, and the lingering fear that he is still out there, watching. And if the old tales are true, if Timothy Caldwell still walks the earth in one form or another, then perhaps he's not gone at all. Perhaps he is closer than we think. Perhaps the boy science couldn't explain is still waiting, somewhere, for the world to try again.
And maybe, just maybe, when the world does,
We'll not like the answer.